this week on the BackTable podcast.
Whose unmet need are we trying to solve? And increasingly, it's not the patient's unmet need or the doctor's unmet need. It is the payer's unmet need. What are the customer acquisition and sales channels, and who's going to pay for it? These are the types of things that goes into my mind before I, step into something. And once you have that idea and you get past that step, you have to recognize, where do you need help? You need engineering help? Do you need business help? And you have to gather people around you that you trust, you like, are capable, who complement you. And then the company starts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the BackTable Innovation Podcast. You can find all previous episodes of our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and on backtable.com. This is our next installment in the BackTable Innovation Show, where you will hear stories from physician entrepreneurs who are helping to drive healthcare forward through MedTech innovation. This is Bryan Hartley as your host this week. I'm a radiologist living in Silicon Valley and co-founder of an early-stage medical device company in the pulmonary space. We are so excited about our special guest this week, Dr. Mahmood Razavi. Mahmood is a serial entrepreneur and world-renowned interventional radiologist. He has co-authored or authored over 300 publications, abstracts, and book chapters. He's also co-founded an incredible 8 companies with an impressive 4 exits, including stroke device company Neuravi, all combined returning close to $600 million. He's served on the board or been an advisor of over 40 additional companies. That being said, he has rare experience starting several successful companies, and he's had the opportunity to observe many others as a board member. So today, we're hopefully going to hear a little bit about his experience and what are some of the key elements to think about if you want to start a company. So with that, it's such an incredible career. It is so great to have you with us today, Mahmood.
Thank you, Bryan, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Awesome. Okay. So at the beginning, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Where do you live? What's your training background? And we'll go from there.
I'm an interventional radiologist by training. I completed my medical school at the University of Southern California, did residency at UCLA, and fellowship at Stanford, then went back to UCLA and the VA as a year in faculty, and then went back to Stanford as faculty for about 10 years or so, 11 years. And then went to a private world, was a year with a group of cardiologists in Bay Area, and then joined a multi-specialty group down in Orange County, California, where I live now.
Awesome. And so how long, you said you were at Stanford for 10 years, correct?
Yeah, I was there from 1995 through 2005.
Okay. And I think I read, were you fellowship director at one point?
Yeah, I was the fellowship director. It was a privilege to be there. It was truly an honor. And during those 10 years, 3 years, 3 fellows per year. If you look at, those 30 fellows, they're who's who of interventional radiology. So I'm proud of that.
That's awesome. Can you give us some names there?
Well, yeah, we've had, during those years, we had Stephen Key, Suresh Vedanta, Dan Z, Rusty Hoffman, and a number of others, Rob Min, Manrito Setu. These are all people who have achieved great things in their careers. We have chairmen of radiology, multi-million-dollar NIH grants, chiefs of sections, other entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs. It was a great group under the direction of Mike Dake.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Yeah. And we've spoken with Mike Dake, and he has a great story to tell as well. So tell me, what does your practice look like now?
Well, I'm in a multi-specialty practice here, and we don't do any diagnostic, but we do all the interventional, and we're not part of the radiology group. And it is a private practice with a very strong academic component. We lead the clinical trial center for the whole cardiovascular unit at the hospital. That includes surgery, cardiology, and of course, interventional radiology.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Let's dive into your innovation career, which is extremely impressive. So Can you tell us, what was your first innovation project? How did you get into innovation, and maybe a little bit about your role?
Well, it's interesting. When I was at UCLA resident, it was the hub of picture archiving communication systems at the time in the early 90s. And there were a lot of engineers that we worked with and doing research with. And you could see a lot of people have new ideas and software, and it was quite impressive. And we had a lot of hits and misses back then, trying to, we were entrepreneurs wannabe. And didn't know how to be entrepreneurs. We did have, there was one engineer that had a software that he and I got together. I don't want to call it a success, but, we sold it. But my own thing started actually late in my residency and early in my fellowship. The carotid stenting was coming on the scene. And I decided that carotid stenting needs a distal protection device or a proximal protection device. The idea of having a protection device obviously wasn't new, but there was nothing in the market. And so I designed something and I didn't know what to do with it. So I went around trying to sell it to the company representatives, knowing, how ignorant I was. I had no idea what to do with it. And so there was a startup company at the time. Again, I didn't know the difference between a real company and a startup company, who was trying to commercialize, and they were in the neuro space. They came around to UCLA and I met them, and met the rep, not the company.
Mm-hmm.
And I showed him the device, and he said, "Oh, let me connect you to my CEO." And then so we made a trip to Northern California. And little did I know at the time, the company had itself been acquired by a larger company. And I gave all the stuff, my protection device to them. And then later on, they got mired into a lot of lawsuits with the companies, so on and so forth. So nothing happened. Interestingly enough, about the same time, there was another cardiology fellow who had a different design, and he went about it the right way, and it was a successful exit, and the device is still in use. And then after that, 3-4 other protection devices came out, all successful. So mine, obviously, because I had no idea what to do, nothing happened to it.
Okay. There's a lot there. So you designed this device, you said. Where were you in your career again? You said late residency, during fellowship as well?
Yeah.
Okay. And you designed a protection device. How did you prototype it or design it? Did you just make drawings? Did you file patents? Those things?
None of those. That's where sort of naivety comes in. I know I had a lot of drawings, I had a lot of concepts, and without having made a prototype, I sort of thought that I knew what French size it needs to be. Of course, that just comes from the fact that I didn't know anything, and then that translated into a sort of a semi-prototype product that with the startup. And through that, I actually met the engineer at that startup, who was the CTO at the time, that we later on did another company together. But did not file patent, did not make prototype, didn't get anywhere past some drawings.
Okay, so you said you ended up working with the CTO later on and founded another company. That's interesting. But I guess looking back, what would you have done differently? Because it sounds like you learned a lot from this situation. So I'd love for our listeners to hear, like, if you could kind of just concretize that time period and say what you would do a little differently.
Yeah, we see you're a product of your environment and your learning process and your experiences. And I was in a highly academic environment. The idea was not to make money, but to contribute to science at UCLA. Stanford's environment was a little bit different in that it was both. And, it took me a while to learn. What would I have done differently is what I would recommend people doing right now. Start from step one. You do your research, you file the IP, you find people to help you. The key issue is going to be you have to have a mentor in the process. You have to talk to others. One of the biggest mistakes I have made throughout my career, that's the entrepreneurship and the development of device and companies. that I tried to learn by observation rather than by asking and active engagement. When I was at the Stanford, just around me, around the office, the corridor that I was on, was Tom Fogarty, Paul Yell, Peter Fitzgerald, Mike Dave, even John Simpson. I worked in his group. These are some big names, and I always tried to observe rather than go knock on their door, say, hey, Paul, Tom, Mike, John, I have this idea. What do you guys think? I never got a good mentor, and I tried to learn by trial and error. That's a mistake. If there's one lesson that budding entrepreneurs or those in the middle of processes, companies can take away from this, is that you gotta find somebody who's done it before, gotta involve them, get a mentor, and ask a lot of questions.
Oh, that's great. So should any of our listeners, if they're going through a similar process or have thoughts of starting a company, should you be afraid of going to talk to people? I mean, from an IP standpoint, do you recommend filing IP first and then kind of going to have these exploratory conversations, or do you think that just let kind of serendipity take its turn there and synchronicity and see if they can potentially add to it? I guess some people might be afraid to share their idea for fear that someone might steal it.
I understand that. It depends on who the person is. If you're going to talk to advisors to get advice, consultants, and you're going to have a cadre of those for each idea that you have, no, I understand. You have to sort of protect yourself. But as a mentor, and that somebody that you trust or who will guide you, it's good to be able to trust someone. Now, if someone is uncomfortable with that, you can always file a provisional patent. You can put some ideas, put your ideas on paper and file something, or even put your ideas on paper, sign them, and date them. Those can all provide protection. But if you don't trust someone, obviously, they won't be a good mentor. It's important to protect yourself, but also at some point you're going to have to be able to talk to others and trust at some level to get good advice.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to reiterate what you said about filing a provisional patent. I think that's very important. If you listeners, if you do have any question about who you're speaking with, always file a provisional. You can write something down. It doesn't have to be fancy, and it costs $140 as a small entity to file a provisional patent. So I totally agree. It's always a good idea.
Yeah, remember, a provisional patent is just a placeholder. Okay, it's just basically the document that you had an idea. And whenever you do a provisional patent and you later on file the patent, they may look very different, but at least it gives you the comfort level and protection to talk to others.
Right, and from my understanding, the provisional it is published after a year, but it, like you said, it can look extremely different from the actual utility patent that you file. But in case there is any litigation down the road, the provisional can be very important to document that you had these ideas on that date.
All documents are important, even if they're not filed. So if you talk to anyone, my suggestion is have a notebook which each page is numbered, so it's shown that you didn't remove anything or add anything, and date them and write it. This is what I learned from one of my co-founders at Trivascular, that any conversation he had with anybody, including regarding the business and regarding any aspect of the company, he would write notes and then date them and say, that day I spoke to X, Y, and Z about such and such. Here's what we talked. Very brief summary. And those types of things can become very helpful down the road, not only to juggle your mind, but also if any legal issues come up.
Totally. If you definitely want to have that written down in case somebody does help you with an invention or they add a component to it. You always want to make sure to include them as an inventor because that can cause a lot of problems down the road. Or if you don't want them to invent, it's also very important that you say that to them, so that you don't get into that sticky situation on the back end.
That's particularly true if you're in academics and if you have an idea out of academia and you want to involve other academicians. So that's important. But those are very nitty gritty
They are.
details of the stuff down the road. If somebody's thinking about those things, it means that they've made a lot of progress already.
That's right. And that brings us back. Thank you. Just one more question about you that I definitely want to get into what you would suggest if our listeners would like to start a company. So you've co-founded 8 companies, several exits, you've advised dozens more. What do you think makes you different from other physicians? I mean, it's kind of incredible that you're a practicing physician and you've co-founded so many companies and had several successful exits. So what makes you different?
No, I'm not any different than anybody else. I am just as dumb and just as smart as the nigga. In fact, most people I meet are smarter than I am. It's just that having been at Stanford for that period of time, and again, observations, especially Mike Dig. Mike Dig was one of the most creative guys I've ever met. He had ideas every which way. And he didn't commercialize all of them, but he didn't do much about, I guess, 99% of his ideas. But that was quite a learning experience for me. But then you look around and you say, okay, well, Tom and Paul and Peter, all these guys are here. They're making money off their ideas. And how do I do that? I think gradually I learned. So the idea, the thought process is that if there's a problem, there's a solution. And in that solution, you can do both good and well.
That's right. Okay, that's great. And do you think, there's a difference between being somebody who, tries to tackle a large number of problems versus being focused on one and taking it through to completion, say commercialization? Because I think what's important to say for our listeners is that, it's not all about money, right? But it is important that you have partners who can commercialize your idea or your device so that it does get to patient care. Because if there isn't a return for a company, they aren't going to commercialize it. And your device will never reach patient care.
You brought up a good point that reminds me of something that I've discussed with potentially best, entrepreneurs, future entrepreneurs, and the companies who come for me for consultation. If you look at the whole process of invention, I'm going to give you some examples here. From the idea, back of the napkin idea, you put something on that, on a paper, you see a problem and you want to solve it, to the design of the product and then prototyping and then following the patents and the IP and then going through the fundraising and then all the stuff that's involved in the testing it, preclinical, benchtop, preclinical, clinical, and then trial design and then going through the regulatory process. And now it starts the manufacturing and the scaling to commercialization, many, many steps. Which one of those do you think is the biggest hurdle?
Probably towards the end, I imagine.
It is the last step. It's the commercialization. None of those. You see a lot of people get stuck in the FDA process or fundraising or the IP or none of the. I give engineers. I'll give you that. You'll solve all the problem. The trial design, the regulatory, all of that. It's all about commercialization. It's the conundrum of commercialization. So when an idea comes to me or a startup comes to me, I assume they have solved all of those. And I look at that last step and I ask myself, what is the commercial potential? Will the users buy it? Who's going to buy it?
Yeah.
Who are the stakeholders? They need to understand the stakeholders and who's the customer, and what, whose unmet need are they addressing? Remember, when I talk about stakeholders, it means, the payers, the patients, the doctors operating the companies. Whose unmet need are we trying to solve? And increasingly, it's not the patient's unmet need or the doctor's unmet need. It is the payer's unmet need. What are the customer acquisition and sales channels and who's going to pay for it? These are the types of things that goes into my mind before I, step into something. And let me give you 2 examples here. Interesting.
Please.
This is, in the past year and a half, I see a lot of startup companies. I see a lot of deals, both for consultation and investment. A company came to me with a very, very interesting idea that they have. It's a software-based idea based on CT imaging that would prognosticate carotid disease. Okay. So think about it. Interesting idea, because we're, treating all these carotid, diseases, but we don't know which one is the one that's going to prevent or cause a stroke, right? We just don't know. We just go by the, the criteria that were established 50 years ago of degree of stenosis. Great idea. But the problem there is, I give them all the developmental problems, regulatory,
that they figured it out.
That's it. You're going to figure all that. At the end of it, let's follow the money. Okay, let's see who's going to pay for it. If you think about that, what you're doing, you're taking an established pathway for patients that goes from a internist typically to a vascular surgeon, right? Most of them, vascular surgeon, and who does a duplex ultrasound and a vascular lab, most of the time their own vascular lab, and you're switching that and the decision making to CT, right? So you're changing
radiology.
That's right. You're changing the pathway of patient flow and decision making, and more importantly, the dollar flow. So, what do you think the commercial potential of that is going to be, right?
Low.
And then there's no payment for it. They're creating something, and that doesn't bother me, because you can always go to CMS and get payments for it.
But the pushback would be probably high from the vascular surgeons who might lose out on this vascular lab that they have control.
Exactly. It's the fundamentals of patient flow and the flow of money. That's why, most fibroid patients don't get embolization. Now, compare that to another company that has the same type of approach to different disease entity, and that's abdominal aortic gangrenos. Okay. Also CT-based, also software, also a prognosticator. Who should get treated, right, of the abdominal aortic aneurysms? But there is no change of the flow of patients, because those are the patients who are already getting CT exam, who are already getting diagnosis, right? There is no changing the dollar flow, nor the patient flow, right? So therefore, which one do you think is going to be more successful? Well, probably, if I were to invest, I would invest in the latter rather than the former. Now, the former guys, they're smart enough, they're going to figure it out, obviously. But those are sort of examples of that last bit of that process that we talked about, commercialization. That's what you need to think about, and all the stuff that we just talked about.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, you really do need alignment of stakeholders, and like you said, it's kind of the last yard that can be the most difficult to overcome, because that's where you're trying to, if I might summarize, that's where you're trying to change behavior. And, changing behavior is probably one of the hardest things we could possibly do.
Exactly. As opposed to, this process of, if you're trying to solve an unmet need and you have a new device, you look at its efficacy, complications, user friendliness, and cost. It's more, obviously more extensive.
Quantifiable.
More extensive than that. If you look at those, say, which one of those, is my new idea going to address? And it's going to have to be all of those. And don't take your eyes off of the cost at the end, because as we talk, as we said, who's going to pay for it? And that all comes into that commercialization piece. There was an idea on navigation that, came out of a very famous U.S. university, but they're also part of a very capitated system. And lots of investments, and it was in some venture forum. It was just a sexy idea as hell. It just looked great, but it was expensive. At the end of it, I asked the CEO of the same system, I said, would you guys buy it? He said, oh, no. So that tells you whether you should invest or not.
Wow. Okay, that's great so far. I think that's a really good segue here. So to summarize, keep your eyes on the last yard here when you're developing an idea. None of this happens in a vacuum. You do it stepwise, right? The whole process from unmet need, prototyping, fundraising, that's stepwise. But You have to keep a bird's eye view over everything, and you need to have at least some answer for every single step along the way, including the last one. Who's going to pay for it? Why would they pay for it? And who stands to lose from it? Because if you implement this and you get it to commercialization, there could be losers. For example, I'll throw out there HeartFlow, the company here close to where I am that's changing the way we diagnose cardiac lesions. And they absolutely are changing the whole workflow process. Instead of those patients going straight to maybe the cath lab, now they're being able to rule out low-risk patients with CT. And that definitely has been probably a mountain for them to climb. So with that, now that we kind of have a bird's eye view, let's jump back to the beginning. And let's say, so our listeners want to start a company. We have a couple of steps here we'd like to go through. First off, let's start with the desire to start a company. Why start a company in your mind? What does it offer for practicing physicians?
It's exciting, and it's wanting to do something about it, wanting to see your idea out there and in play and in the hands of others. There's a certain satisfaction beyond just the financial gains. I don't want to minimize the financial gains and the incentives that finances, provide, but it is, great satisfaction to see your product out there in the hands of others and that you have solved the problem. As you know, this life of the startup or going through startup is a roller coaster. A lot of highs and lows, many times, sometimes even in a single day. So it's not for the weak at heart.
That is what I can definitely attest to that. It's absolutely true. The day-to-day variability is huge. So let's dive into that a little bit. Tell me, how difficult are startups in terms of hours, stress? Do you spend nights and weekends working on startups? Do you stress about it for long periods of time? Or, tell us a little bit about some of those highs and lows, maybe.
Yeah, the answer to all of those is yes, yes, and yes. So yes, after hours, yes, on weekends. And because, during working hours, I had made a conscious decision that I'm going to keep my day job. And that could be both bad and good, in how much risk you want to take. As I mentioned earlier, finding a mentor, but just as important is finding people who would help you with the process. So say you have an idea. I'll give you an example, and let's go to Nurabi. Okay. That the story of Trivascular was more fun, but Nurabi is more practical. So and then remind me to talk about a couple of other things like laser associated scientists, because there's a lot of learning curves over there for the new guys who are getting into the business. When I came down to Southern California from Stanford, when you're in an academic environment, the neuro and peripheral interventions are separate, right? We never did stroke. We never went above the neck. The most I went above the neck was to put a carotid stent in, and that caused a lot of problems for me at Stanford also. So when I came down here, there were 3 interventional radiologists, including myself, and we did a stroke. And so they told me, "Oh, we do a stroke. You go learn it." I said, "Well, I've never done a stroke. I have no interest in a stroke." They said, "Yeah, no, you don't have a choice because there's 3 of us and we're taking call every third, and you got to handle it."
Wow.
So long story short, I learned about stroke, and then the first stroke patient comes and I'm doing it. And I said, "Wow, this space is in dark ages. And this isn't the late 2000s.
Right.
There's nothing here. There's a Mercy device that works, at the best 50% of the time. And then we have to give TPA. It was very frustrating to get to the site of clot and not be able to do anything. So that started this whole process of, there's got to be a better way, the usual sort of thing. A few years before that, there was a guy by the name of Chris Shin, medical student at Stanford, who is, by the way, a successful VC, an entrepreneur himself. And he was working at a group at Guidant, which they developed stuff. And he had a stent on a wire sort of idea that they had filed IP. He was aware of it because he was working in my lab, but I had nothing to do with it. So it seemed to me that, yeah, that's a good idea. We could do that. And then I traced it and found out that the idea is, was Guidant, and Guidant was split between Boston Scientific and Abbott, and that idea is in the Abbott, so that patent family.
Mm-hmm.
I put some ideas together and I went to my contacts in Abbott and I said, well, okay, I need those patents. And they went around and said, yeah, well, we're not doing anything with it. Here it is, and let's discuss terms. So we discussed some terms. Now all of that is settled. Now what? Now I need engineers. I need somebody to run it. I need a full team that looks credible, at least 2 or 3 people that we can go raise money. And so I went to a few people I knew, and then the second person, the first guy I wanted that just didn't take it seriously, didn't come. The second person I knew had not run a company before, but he was part of the startup. And he was incredibly smart and thorough. So I convinced him, after some arm twisting, to come and join us. He came on board and he brought another engineer on board, and he had a fantastic mentor. That became Razavi. Once you have that idea and you get past that step, you have to recognize, where do you need help? You need engineering help, do you need business help? And you have to gather people around you that you trust, you like, are capable, who complement you. And then the company starts.
Fantastic. I think the team is so important early on. But so how did you fund this? That's a good, I wonder, if you're a physician out in private practice, you've got this idea, there's a technology out there that you think could be maybe a little better, and then it could be commercialized. But you also need funding to hire your co-founder and the engineer. So where did that come from?
Yeah, what I have done throughout all the companies that I've been involved with is that I use equity as early on as investment. And I have no problem imparting with equity to bring the people that I want in. And that's what I did here. I made the CEO my equal partner and a co-founder. And then when the engineer came on board, we didn't want, he was a very high-end engineer. We didn't have a whole lot of money to pay him, so we gave him equity and we told him, we'll make you a co-founder, which looks good for his resume. So the early on, for some of the filing IPs and things of that sort, most of us can afford that, and you put some money in and formation of the company. But once you get into even prototyping, it can't be, it's not that expensive. But when you want to go seriously and in earnest, you need money, and you should do a whole program on ins and outs of how to raise money. One of the things that we've done, the CEO that I brought, he wanted to move back to Ireland, and he said one of the advantages is that we can bring government money in. And so even in the U.S., there are a lot of paths for non-dilutive money to come in, through the Small Business Administration.
Yeah, SBIR.
Absolutely. And then and you can get a lot of research money. There are a lot of companies even around here, they know that they're like $15-16 million in it, all grants. It can be difficult and time consuming to get grants, but at some point you're going to have to get serious money in. Now, if you have a network of individuals that invest, that always is great, because the VC money or venture capital money, in my opinion, should be the last money you bring in.
Okay.
But then, if you're looking for 15, 16 million, 17 million, it's hard to, put it together through a network of a few people. You have to have a big amount of money, and
lots of money.
They invest, and you have to have a connection. You have to have, somebody to connect you to those. And friends and family early on, and then you have to go out there and start raising money from institutional money, which is
VCs, or corporate strategic.
Absolutely. Now, I recommend that Lindsay McCann in Vancouver has a great talk on pros and cons of raising money from strategics. But those people who don't know what the term strategic means, it just means bigger companies who are commercializing. They're commercial companies. We call them strategics. I don't know why.
Like Medtronic, Johnson and Johnson.
Boston Scientific, Agilent, you name it. There are pros and cons of raising money from them and having them at the table as investors. So I would recommend everybody to sort of listen to that.
Okay, great. That's a great recommendation. Now, you said VC money should be the last money to bring in. Just to close that loop, why? Is it because they're the most expensive, I assume?
Yeah, they're very expensive. Now, as I mentioned to you, I use equity as an investment. When I bring my advisors in, first of all, let me finish the thought on investment. I want to go into this advisor and the equity. VC money can be quite expensive. They take a chunk of your company, and if you go into Series B, that means the second stage of financing, getting ready to go through pivotal trials or even commercialization. The founders usually by then have lost control of the company, and they're in the MedTech, in the medical device business, your shares are probably going to be in the single-digit percentages. So you want to bring that money when you definitely need it, but also there is such a thing as speed. And if that money means that you will get to your target faster by diluting yourself, so be it. Because again, 100% of nothing is not worth anything.
No, that's a really, really good point. It's this constant push and pull, tug of war between being frugal as possible to keep your dilution down as a co-founder, but also negotiating speed and path to commercialization, because more than likely, if you're doing it, possibly somebody else is doing it, or somebody else is working on a solution that would completely obviate the need for your device.
Yeah, anytime you think you have a new idea, the chances are that 5 people are ahead of you and 5 people are at the same time as you.
Yeah, that is a really good way of looking at it, and it always keeps you on your toes if you're thinking like that.
So, the one other thing I wanted to mention is, we were talking about building teams and all of that, that you want to bring some advisors and consultants and beyond that mentor just 1 or 2 people. And I see a lot of mistakes a lot of startups make, and they try to get frugal and stingy with parting with equity. Once you identify the critical people who will help you along the path, now that this could be scientific, could be medical, could be trial design, could be with the FDA, or could be with the strategics, because there are those who are influencers out there, right, and have influence. Those are the ones that I have, at least in my companies, have been very generous with, and I see it as an investment. In some of the companies that I've been involved with, I give my medical advisors, not mentor, the advisors, 1% of the company each, which flips people's up. But you know something? It's a fantastic investment. Every time I've done that, they have come through. And every time somebody has done that to me, I have come through. And so I want to advise you that once you identify who those key people are, use your equity, not unwisely, but as an investment. It is an investment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm going to hit on again that you need to make sure that those are the guys that are going to solve problems down the road. And when you identify them, you absolutely should use, the tool of equity to keep them, they have skin in the game, and they're going to pull the levers that they have at their disposal to move the project, move the company one step down the road.
You said, what are the elements of success? There are a lot. The commitment of the entrepreneur or the inventor. There's a famous saying by Mark Cuban, who's famously said that to be successful entrepreneur, you need to be committed to your company. And if you have an exit strategy, you're not committed. Now, with all due respect to him, in MedTech, that does not work. Yeah. Because because
you're not. It costs a lot of money to build from the ground up with a medical device. You know more than I do. How much does it cost for to get a device all the way?
It's not. Healthcare is a highly consolidated ecosystem. Okay, it is truly an oligarchy. commercializing, going back to what we first talked about, the commercialization is the hardest step. Commercializing, for a startup, you may not have the bandwidth or the muscle to do that. You need some of these strategics. Therefore, exit strategy gotta be in your mind from day one. Am I going to commercialize this and make it into a business, or am I to go the way of IPO? There've been 3 recent very successful ones, obviously, in this space. By the way, all 3 of them tried to sell themselves and exit, and they couldn't. So they went down the other path, and lo and behold, they were very successful because they had geniuses on the commercial side of things. Or do I want to have a plan on exit? And that's where knowing who to bring in as advisors really helps.
Absolutely, because they can tell you things like what I've had to learn is that you mentioned this before. Commercialization is probably one of the most important and hardest steps. And that includes getting your product out to hospitals. And getting your product out to hospitals requires sales distribution channels. And those distribution channels are probably the most expensive part of the entire project. They can be. So what we're talking about here is potentially leveraging the distribution channels of the strategics. Medtronic for sure has people in every hospital. So does J&J, Abbott. A lot of these companies already have a presence there. They already have staff that your device may be able to fit into the bag, the sales bag, so to speak, of their salespeople. Whereas if you were going to do this yourself, maybe you can speak. How much would that cost to hire a sales team and train them up and send them out into the world?
It's very expensive. And if you get to that stage, you can bet that as a founder, unless you finance it yourself, in which case, you probably have enough money you don't need that.
Yeah.
But you're
right.
down into 1 or 2%, and you're
right.
diluted down to nothing. And so, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's key. That is so key to understand that these sales representatives they are specialized. They're highly specialized and really good at what they do. And they are not cheap. They can, their salaries are very high as they should be. And then you have to include all of the things like benefits, et cetera. So that, these numbers may be wrong, but they may cost upwards of $400,000, $500,000 per sales representative, including all in with all of the benefits and things.
That's true. But remember, it's not just putting the sales force together. As you know, I mentioned that MedTech is an oligarchy now. It is about contracting. It's by the way, on the provider side also, there's only a few handful of large purchasers for hospitals and health systems in the country. You have to talk to them. So it's single device companies, no matter how good your device is, are probably going to have a hard time in the future. Because you don't have the
leverage.
Yeah, absolutely. So for many, many reasons, the environment for commercialization is very, very difficult, and it has to do with, again, consolidated ecosystem that medicine is.
And so I guess bringing this full circle, the reason why we're bringing this up is that this is why having strategic partners can be so helpful, because they have the leverage with group purchasing organizations. They have the sales channels. They have all of these things that have already been figured out. So, once you have your ducks in a row, it can be a good idea to approach a strategic, when you're considering exiting or partnering.
That you could approach them early on also, so they sort of have an idea of what you're doing. But that also has to do with whether your invention or your idea is a company or a product, right?
Right.
If it's a product, you have a better design for an existing technology or are you creating a whole new category or a new treatment? For example, let's use the stents. Stents have been around for a while for the arterial side. And if you wanted to change the stent a little bit for the arterial side, that would be a product. But if you apply it to a new disease like veins, well, that could be a company. So those are the considerations that, it has to go through an inventor's mind, the entrepreneur's mind. What are we going to do? If it is a product, then obviously you want to license it, and you want to involve a company or a strategic early on. If it is a company, then the timing depends on your fundraising cycle and a lot of other considerations.
That's a key distinction that I'd love to kind of get a little bit more contrast on between a product and a company. So when you're saying stents, if you're just reinventing the stent, basically that would be a product. And the reason that would be a product is because there are so many of them out on the market already that you would not go through the process of hiring a sales force, determining, who are you going to sell this to, because that really at that point, the hospitals can just choose another iteration of their device. Why would they give you kind of the time of day?
Yeah, I mean, the company, basically a product is something that has a lower market potential.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I'll give you an example of, when fibroids came along, and fibroids were becoming a thing, embolization. If you had a different catheter like the, RUC, the Roberts Urine Curve, that's a product. But if you had a different embolic agent way back then, that could be a company.
Mm-hmm.
No longer is the case now, in terms of embolization. Now, for example, let's say you want to get involved in the prostate embolization.
Mm-hmm.
Most product there would be a product or inventions. It won't be companies unless you have all of a sudden, let's say, a drug-eluting bioabsorbable bead of some kind with some magical power, and that could be a company. The stents, we use the example of the stents. The stents in the SFA, renals, carotid, whatever, they were products but if you wanted to apply them to a whole new disease, veins, that would be a company.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I think looking at the market impact is a great way of deciding product versus company. Is it an iterative process? Are you iterating on a design that's already there? You're making it a little bit better, or are you truly innovating or creating a whole nother class of device? That's probably a good way of looking at it. Now, briefly, nuts and bolts here of forming a company. You talked a lot about kind of the ideas, the desire, the elements of success. Team is so important. Funding, we touched on. Formation. So early on, well, you tell me, when do you get, say, attorneys involved? When do you talk about equity between co-founders? Kind of nuts and bolts corporate housekeeping stuff.
The agreements between the co-founders got to be day one, even before you get the attorneys involved, because the expectations have to be clear. Otherwise, a year into it, there's going to be all sorts of conflicts. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
there has to be, if there are multiple people involved, they all have to know what their role is and what their equity is. That's got to be settled. Formation of a company, it doesn't cost very much. You can do it online, or we usually go to typical corporate, offices and set up a company. That shouldn't cost you very much. And also remember, any corporate housekeeping that lawyers would do for you nowadays for startups, you can also settle them, settle the bill when you raise money. They all do that. You don't have to pay them up front. So the corporate lawyers don't cost much. It's the IP attorneys that can cost quite a bit. Although I must tell you, I pulled one of my companies. I pulled a coup, and I went to a very famous law firm in IP, and the idea was hot enough that they agreed for a percentage of the company, which was,
wow, that's rare,
fraction of a percent, to do it for free. Everything is negotiable, remember, especially with lawyers.
Wow. No, I think that's a fantastic point, especially with the corporate attorneys, the guys who are going to put together your formation documents, who are going to document your capitalization table, which is your equity split, puts together your board and everything else, all the documents you need. That is very negotiable. And in fact, a lot of these attorneys, as you said, will defer their payments for either some amount of time or combination of time and until you raise a certain amount of money. And once you hit that funding milestone, then they're like, okay, you need to pay the bill. IP, is different. That's a lot of times that was a unique situation you're in, but a lot of the intellectual property attorneys, patent attorneys will not defer, and they can probably be the most expensive attorney fees you pay, and probably should be when you consider the value they can add.
That's true. That's true. It's having a good patent attorney that really pays for itself down the road.
Absolutely. And so, all right, that is great. That is such great information. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how do you do all this work-life balance? What do you co-founded 8 companies, 4 have exited. You're, world-renowned IR. You were publishing, all of that. You seem very busy. So how do you achieve work-life balance for our listeners out there? First off, is it possible?
Oh yeah, of course it's possible. It doesn't mean I got it right. I definitely got it wrong. If you have young children, treasure that. Definitely treasure that, because once your kids hit the late high school and college, I mean, they're gone. So there is definitely balance in favor of the family early on. My children are older and they're out of college and things of that sort. And so it's easier for me to spend my weekends, working on my hobbies. My wife says that she says, I work at the hospital to pay for all the intellectual property attorneys. So I support my hobby of startup companies, but it's an art to be able to get the balance right between different priorities. So my suggestion is you have to prioritize. If you want to have a successful company, you have a checklist and you go down your checklist. Every worthwhile endeavor in life needs to have a checklist, and you go down your checklist. Create a checklist for yourself, prioritize what's important to you, and stick to those priorities.
And that's fantastic. Okay, what a great talk. I think if I were going to summarize some important points that you said, and there were a lot of them, so I'm definitely going to miss some. But at the beginning, we talked about always think about the entire process. Commercialization can often be the hardest and most expensive part of developing a device. You need to think about who is going to pay for it and what effect is it going to have on the various stakeholders. Next is team. Where do you need them? Who complements you? Find them and make sure to use equity. Equity is a powerful tool to recruit, so don't be afraid to use it when it's necessary. Next, mentorship. Always find a good mentor and potentially advisors as well. Finally, understand the difference between a product and a company. That will really help you down the road define the pathway that the device needs to take. Is it completely innovative? Is starting a new class of device, or is it using a device in a new part of the body? That can be a company, but that means it's going to be a lot more money going down the road to get to commercialization. Whereas a product did you iterate on something? Did you make a new guide wire, a new micro catheter that's more flexible, a new stent? Those are along the lines of products. You're definitely going to need some strategic help with the distribution channels. Wow. All right. You've said a lot of things. I don't know. Is there anything I missed that you would put in there? Prioritize work-life balance. You need to also prioritize with everything you do, make a checklist and just go down the list to make sure you don't forget anything. Did I forget anything?
I forgot a lot.
All right, great. Well, Mahmood, thank you so much. We would love to have you back. There's just so much to talk about. You can't do it in an hour, but each one of these things that we've talked about could take an entire show, and we would love to have you back.
Well, it was fun, and thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye.